When De Morga set sail in his flagship, a hastily converted merchant vessel, to fight the Dutch, his head was full of hopes for future glory. The Dutch commander Van Noort was just as hopeful that his voyage around the world would bring him wealth and fame. For both men, their encounter would be disastrous, but they would both live to tell the tale. That both of these men would change the story somewhat to suit their own interests was of little surprise to anyone.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the heavy burden of the San Diego?
Here we are. Enjoy!
There had been some scramble to prepare any sort of Spanish fleet to protect the waters around the Philippines. The Dutch fleet, now reduced from 5 ships to only 2, was already making itself known by capturing vessels that were coming to trade with the islands and taking food and supplies. In a bold move at one point, Van Noort, the admiral of the fleet, had even managed to convince the officials in the Bay of Albay that they were French ships with special permission to trade in Spanish territories, and he had managed to resupply that way. Though it was initially believed that the ships were English in origin, Governor Teo de Guzman of Manila still began to get ready to defend his territory. It would be best if they were able to defeat the fleet at sea, but he did not have command of any ships of war at the time. Instead, what he was able to get his hands on were 2 trading vessels and some small boats. The San Antonio, the largest of the trading ships, was renamed the San Diego and declared to be the flagship of the fleet. With some hasty modifications, these poorly prepared ships were sent out to face the enemy. Van Noort had sailed from Rotterdam, Holland, with express permission from the Prince of Orange to attack both the Spanish and the Portuguese as he liked. Though Spain did not yet officially recognize that the Dutch were an independent nation that was no longer under the control of the Spanish king, the Dutch had been in self-governance long enough to consider expanding their trade. They had strong incentive to do so. Spain had gained control over Portugal, and with it the port of Lisbon, which had been a main source of spices for the Dutch and had banned them as rebellious subjects. Now instead, the Dutch were forced to send out their own trade fleets towards the East Indies. Van Noort's ships were officially one of these trade fleets, but he took a somewhat more aggressive stance than a strictly commercial one. His hiring of Captain Mellis, an English captain who had been with Cavendish when he had circumnavigated the world, also suggested Van Noort's intention to replicate this achievement for the Dutch. Van Noort, a man with no shortage of experience on the sea, could not be more different than his Spanish counterpart. Dr. Antonio de Morga was not an adventurer or sailor at all. Indeed, he was a senior judge who had on occasion acted as deputy governor of Spanish colonies. He had no experience at all with command over ships at sea, but that would not prevent him from taking command when he saw a chance to prove himself in the eyes of his government. He convinced Governor Teo to appoint him to the head of the fleet, even though there were many people who protested the appointment and asked the governor to appoint someone with more experience. Governor Teo stood by his decision, however, and sent De Morga to go oversee his fleet. The conversion of the San Diego into the fleet's flagship had been a hasty one, and some compromises had to be made due to the lack of supplies and time. There were no ship cannons readily available, and so bronze cannons from the forts in Manila were brought to arm her. These cannons, 14 in all, were much heavier than the standard ship issue, but De Morga was satisfied to have a fully armed ship and turned his attention to the men who would sail with him. Here, De Morga showed his inexperience once again. He seemed under the impression that the more men he could convince to board the ship to fight with him, the better it would be, with no consideration for what the capacity of the San Diego was. Though she was now being used for military matters, she was not a ship owned by the Spanish government. She, therefore, already had the original crew, and one of her owners was also on board. These were not fighting men, however, and to supplement this, some of the local Japanese mercenaries were hired on. These were men who were originally of the samurai class, and had fled when Japan had outlawed Christianity. They could often find work from the Spanish government, and this occasion was no different. Many of the gentry of Manila also decided to participate for the glory of Spain, or to raise their own status. In all, it was estimated that around 450 people were on board when she set sail to chase the Dutch. Many of them were dignitaries who needed to be housed, and so extra cabins were built on the deck for them. They also brought their own supplies and items, adding to the increased load of the San Diego, a ship considered to be a small one. Some have also speculated that some of her original cargo from her days as a trade vessel had never been removed from her hold. Whether or not this is true, witnesses said that the ship was already listing to one side as she left the port and went in search of the enemy. Both the commander of the other converted warship and the owner of the San Diego asked De Morga to add ballast since his ship was clearly poorly balanced and top-heavy, but he ignored their suggestions, whether it was out of impatience or out of ignorance. As De Morga left Cavite, he had no idea how close the Dutch were. His orders from Governor Teo was to follow the enemy wherever they went, even if it required a long voyage. Not only that, but he was also to confront any other hostile ships or pirates that he encountered. As such, he had supplied for a long voyage at sea, with many of the wealthier men bringing their own jars of food and delicacies, as was common at the time. They could have foregone such precautions, however. Having left port December 12th, they discovered the Dutch fleet on the morning of the 14th, anchored off of Friar's Point. Though they were the ones to come across the Dutch fleet, the Dutch, under the command of Van Noort, fired the first shot. The Spanish attempted to return fire, but their first shot only fell between the two ships due to lack of experienced gunners, and they were in a dangerous position. The San Diego, which had a list as she left Cavite, was now wallowing with water up to her gun deck, making it impossible for her to use the large guns that had been brought from the forts because they could not open the gun ports without flooding the ship. Whether this was because of the heavy load on the small ship, or because the list had already caused some flooding, is uncertain. But what was clear was that a long-distance battle was not a good option for De Morga. The small deck guns were proving hard to use as well, since they had built the extra cabins on the deck, which now got in the way. Instead, grappling hooks were deployed, and the two ships were locked together for a fierce battle. Many of the Spanish soldiers and sailors who jumped onto the Dutch flagship they were locked onto, the Mauritius, saw it as an escape from the San Diego. Trust that the San Diego would remain afloat was starting to wane, and here was another ship for the taking. Van Noort originally had not wanted to engage with the enemy at all, and had tried to run, and even considered briefly surrendering when he saw the large number of men boarding his ship, according to De Morga. But if that was a thought, it was short-lived. There are conflicting accounts on both sides of what followed in the confusion of battle, and with both sides having good reason to leave out details. The Spanish had more men, but the Dutch were better armed and better trained fighters. The fighting between the two ships lasted for around 6 hours, with most of the fighting being hand-to-hand, though the Mauritius did occasionally still manage to get off cannon fire into the San Diego. It was hard to miss their target with the two ships locked together. Most of the Dutch crew was wounded or killed in the engagement against an overwhelming force of men, with an estimated only 15 men still in good condition out of the crew of the Mauritius. It looked as though the Spanish would successfully take the ship when a fire of unknown origin appeared on board the Mauritius, and the Spanish were no longer willing to take the risk. It is speculated that Van Noort might have set the fire himself to chase off the enemy. If this is the case, it was successful. Considering the large amount of gunpowder on board the San Diego, and fearing an explosion would take place if the fire spread, the Spanish retreated back to the San Diego and cut themselves free. What the Spanish did not realize was that it had been the Dutch ship that had kept them afloat. The San Diego, already having difficulties before the pitch battle, now also had cannon fire damage to hasten her demise. Almost as soon as she was cut free from the Mauritius, the San Diego listed to one side and began to sink. Though the pilot made an effort to reach Fortune Island to ground the ship, minutes later, the San Diego slipped under the waves. The men on board the San Diego were dressed for battle in heavy suits of armor, and many of them were not able to swim. More yet were trapped in the hold of the ship. It will never be known exactly how many people died in the sinking. Van Noort and his men were harsh in their response to seeing their enemy now in the water. Having put out the fire on their ship, they turned to vengeance, and armed with lances and poles, they did their best to kill the men they saw in the water around their ship. The nearby battle between the other ship of the Dutch fleet and the other ship of the Spanish fleet went very differently. Using his overpowering force of men, the commander of the Spanish ship, the San Bartolome, led the charge onto the Dutch ship personally. Though here too a fire broke out, he ordered his men to put it out, and the Dutch surrendered. In total, the San Bartolome lost only one man in their battle against the other Dutch ship. The men of the San Bartolome then looked to see if there was help needed in the capture of the Mauritius, but they saw no fighting taking place, and assumed that the ship was now under Spanish control, since earlier it had seemed as though they were winning. Though the Mauritius then turned and sailed away from them, they still did not question it, thinking that their victory had been seen, and knowing that De Morga was not very good at communicating his plans to the rest of the men who sailed with him. De Morga and about 100 of his men were instead swimming to Fortune Island. The next day, he found some small boats that he was able to use to return to port in, and there faced the questions about how the entire affair had been handled. Though there was an inquiry, as well as official complaint letters about De Morga's incompetence sent to Spain, De Morga would escape any consequence for his actions, and instead go on to a position as an Inquisition judge in Mexico. He would later publish his account of the incident, glossing over almost the entire loss of the San Diego, and instead stressing how close he had come to taking the Mauritius. Van Noort was forced to abandon his attack on the waters around the Philippines and head for home, having suffered a large personal financial blow since he had funded his expedition personally. He did complete his voyage around the world as he had planned, however, making his voyage the first Dutch circumnavigation of the globe. He too would write an account, his stressing the sinking of the San Diego more than most of the other events in that conflict. In all, the truth probably is somewhere in the middle of the two, but not something we will ever know for sure. In 1991, Frank Gaudiot, a French underwater archaeologist, found the wreck where it still lay 400 years after the battle that sank it. The artifacts have been divided. Some have been brought to the Naval Museum in Madrid, and some have been brought to the National Museum of the Philippines. There is a treasure trove of items to be seen, as well as insights into the final moments of the ship. One of the people who dove to the wreck said that it seemed as though most of the cannons had been brought to one side of the ship. This is not mentioned in De Morga's account, but it would certainly explain the ship's heavy list and how useless the cannons were if it is the case. Among the items found in the wreckage are samurai swords that once belonged to the Japanese mercenaries, as well as fine pottery that was imported from China. Manila was a part of Spain's trade route with China, but such items still would have cost the people living in the Philippines a good deal of money. Their presence speaks to the incredible wealth and privilege of those on board when the ship sank. In the items found was also the most definitive proof of the identity of the wrecked ship, a solid gold seal bearing De Morga's coat of arms on it. It was considered an important enough find that it was declared a national cultural treasure of the Philippines. Though De Morga sought to brush over his involvement with his greatest failure, his name, as well as his crest, are now symbols of that very wreck. For De Morga's account of his time in the Philippines, please see Events in the Philippine Islands by Dr. Antonio de Morga, translated by Blair and Robertson in 1907, or our other sources below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.